The more that you read, the more things you will know. The more that you learn, the more places you'll go. That Dr. Seuss was such a smart guy.
Are you ready to make the most of the only life you have? To make smart money choices focused on achieving what you care about most? Here to help you balance living well today without sacrificing your tomorrow is the Retirement Answer Man, Roger Whitney.
Well, a couple weeks ago, in episode 141, I believe, we had a discussion with Andrew Scott, an economist at the London School and co-author of The 100-Year Life. This was probably one of the most impactful discussions and books I read this year. One concept that he really hit on that I think is really important for you and I is that the knowledge that we have from a skill set for career, but also in our understanding of how the economy and the world is organized, that knowledge decays over time because the pace of innovation is moving so quickly. So if we don't update our understanding of things and our skill set, it's very easy to get trapped in how things were in that whole who moved the cheese way of thinking of things, right? For you and I to thrive in this more independent phase of life, it's important that we update our knowledge, not just in skill sets and things that we enjoy, but in how the world is organized and where those opportunities are. Now, this couples really nicely with the episode we have, I think it was 138, on powerful books that impact how we think and impact our life. And I shared my 10, and I asked you to share with me some books that were impactful to you, which you did, and it was great. I have a huge list that I have compiled, and I'm going to share with you in this coming SixShots Saturday. So I'm excited to finally get that list out to you because there are a lot of great books on that list I'm excited to read, and I imagine there would be for you. So what I thought I'd do is on this week's episode, we're going to talk with Jeff Brown from the great podcast Read to Lead on how to read books more effectively and to draw that knowledge out so we can actually apply them in our life. So that's going to be exciting. But first, we got to get to that important disclaimer. That's right. It's time for that all-important disclaimer, and that is, don't take advice from me. Boom. Don't take advice from me on the show. I don't know anything about you. You don't know that much about me. I do work with clients, and you can go to my website and find out how we can discuss that. But until that time, make sure that you think of this as helpful hints in education. Talk to your investment advisor, your financial advisor, your tax advisor, your legal advisor before you make any decisions, because that's just common sense. Now, let's see what's going on in the news of reading. Since we're talking about reading and expanding our mind, I took a look at some statistics from statisticbrain.com. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. Some of it is pretty shocking and I guess not so surprising. And I'm just going to run through a couple of these and talk about a little bit about some of the implications that it might have. So let me just rattle some of these off. The total percentage of U.S. adults who are unable to read at an 8th grade level, 50%. Total percent of U.S. high school graduates who will never read a book after high school, 33%. Interestingly, the total percentage of college students who will never read a book after they graduate is actually higher. It's 42%. And according to statisticbrain.com, 80% of U.S. families didn't buy a book last year. 70% of U.S. families haven't been in a bookstore for 5 years. Now, I know we got Kindle and all those other things. And just reading 15 minutes a day will equate to reading about 1 million words annually. So the question is, how connected is reading to being successful in life? Well, according to Tom Corley, the author of Rich Habits, The Daily Success Habits of Wealthy Individuals, rich people, those with annual incomes of $160,000 higher and a high net worth, read for self-improvement and education and success. Meanwhile, less wealthy people, those with incomes of about $35,000 or less, read, if at all, for entertainment. So there is a casual connection between success in reading. I think a lot of that has to do with interjecting these new ideas, and also, especially with the self-help books, I'm not a self-help junkie, but I think it helps with the self-talk of who we are and what we're capable of, and that really expands what we might be able to do in the world. Now, notably, there are some very successful people that read a lot of books. According to Warren Buffett, he reads 600 to 1,000 pages per day, which is huge. That was when he was younger, and still devotes about 80% of his day to reading. Bill Gates reads about 50 books per year. He breaks that down to about one a week. Mark Cuban, who I didn't think would be a huge reader, mainly because he's so spastic, he says he reads more than 3 hours every day. I guess maybe if you're rich, you got the time to. I don't know. Elon Musk, the famous Tesla owner, is an avid reader. When he was asked how he learned to build rockets, he said, "I read books." Mark Zuckerberg, so this is the younger dude, resolved to read a book every 2 weeks throughout 2015. So obviously that's not some scientific study that reading will make you wealthy, but I think it correlates very well to more successful people tend to read. And I think that's going to be the same for you and I when we're trying to figure out how to thrive in this more independent phase of life.
Huh? What does that mean?
In the What's That Mean segment today, I want to talk about the word application. Now, you're like, man, I thought this was going to be some technical investment word. No, application. Yes, I know you know what it means, but do you actually do it? So, as a noun, application means the act of putting to a special use or purpose. Now, this is important when we're talking about books. And I know I've fallen into this a lot. I love to read, and I read a lot, I think. Not as much as Warren Buffett did, but I read a lot. And then I always wonder, am I just reading to read? Am I reading? And it's great to have these ideas come into my head. They are mind expanding. They give me some viewpoints. They create ideas for topics for the show on things that we talk about. The question is, though, how much of it am I actually applying in my life? A good example would be one of my favorite books, Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less, by Greg McKeown. Great book. Read it once, read it again, with the idea that I would apply some of the core principles. And even then, I had a hard time doing it. So when we are talking about reading books, I think our guest today has a great way of making them more impactful rather than just being word candy that makes us feel good and we agree with and we move on. He has a great way of documenting the wisdom and the lessons and the concepts so he can actually apply those in our life. So I want you to think about the application of things when we're talking about books and when you get this great list that we're going to have from this week in SixShots Saturday. So if you buy some of those books and you read them, you can actually apply the things that could move the dial in your life so you can thrive. Before we talk to our main guest, I want to encourage you to sign up for SixShots Saturday. And you can do that by going to rogerwhitney.com and just filling in your first name and your email. What you'll receive is every Saturday morning a very short email with 6 quick tips on how to thrive in the later part of life, how to be a little bit happier, and how to take action week by week to create a life that you're excited about. This week, I'll be sharing that PDF of the books that all of you sent to me. I'll be sending you that collection or that reading list, the Retirement Answer Man reading list. Hey, that's pretty cool. Where we can all expand our horizons on the books that could influence our life. And we're going to do it with people that are probably a lot like us. Otherwise, they wouldn't be listening to the show. So if you want to receive that exclusive reading list, sign up for SixShots Saturday and you'll get it this Saturday. Well, today I wanted to bring on someone that could help us learn to read more effectively so we can apply the things that we're reading. And I had the perfect guest. Jeff Brown has a podcast called the Read to Lead podcast, where he, on a weekly basis, has authors come on and talk about their books. And he is very selective on books that he reads and authors that he allows on the show. So obviously he's a voracious reader, and he has learned some techniques on how to read more effectively, but also how to apply the things that you read. Now, Jeff spent 26 years in radio, and you'll know that right off the bat with that radio voice. He's got that great radio voice, very smooth. And now he is the host of an award-winning podcast, the Read to Lead podcast, and he is just a great guy. We have a lot of mutual friends. He lives out in one of my favorite places, that Franklin, Tennessee area. So here's our conversation with Jeff, where he talks about how to read more effectively. So Jeff, you are the host of the Read to Lead podcast. I don't need to tell you that, but were you a reader? Is that why you started that, or what was the idea of diving into books so deeply?
It is, Roger, why I started the show, but I haven't or wasn't always a reader. I spent, as a young child, I was in grade school, junior high, and reading mostly fiction, and The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and things like that really grabbed my attention. The Hardy Boys series was another favorite of mine. Encyclopedia Brown, those books going way, way back. But as I grew up, and as our school system is wont to do, creativity is all but educated out of you.
Yeah.
And I found that those things that fascinated me as a child were things I wasn't supposed to be fascinated by anymore. At least that's what I bought into. And so for my teenage years and my early adult years, 20 to on up into early 30s, I didn't read at all, apart from a magazine now and then, an entertainment magazine usually. But in my early 30s, I was introduced to business books or nonfiction books really for the first time. I'd had someone, a mentor, try to get me interested in those kinds of books in my early 20s, but I was too young and immature to appreciate it.
Right.
But 10 years removed from that, I was in a better position to be receptive to that. And I was working in an environment where, as a staff, we met each week to discuss the books that we were reading. We were all reading, the same book. And that opened my eyes to a whole new world. The first book, I believe, that I cracked open at that time was a book called Purple Cow by Seth Godin. And we read The Five Dysfunctions of a Team by Pat Lencioni. And we read Good to Great by Jim Collins. And I realized that I had been missing out on a lot, on expertise from people far smarter than I was ever going to be, that was wrapped up and packaged quite nicely in a 200-page book that I could get for, $20. And I think if you get one great idea from a book, that's money well spent, especially if it's an idea you implement.
So do you think a lot of that is having the student ready for the teacher? When, I think that's normal when you're in your 20s, you think you know it all and you are just doing, and then life happens a little bit. And then do you think that was your journey of, you realized, wow, there's more out there I need to learn? Or how'd you get
I think that's exactly it. When I discovered nonfiction, when I discovered business books, and I was fascinated about books or books about personal growth and leadership and development, particularly, I couldn't get enough. And so I began reading at a pretty quick pace and was always looking for that next book and trying to find somebody who was like-minded and who I could talk about what I was reading with. And some of that frustration of not having as many people as I would like around me enjoying this as much as I was kind of became rather the itch that needed to be scratched, that was Read to Lead.
Now, I just came back from Denver, and I saw a presentation yesterday by a doctor who was describing the brain and the limbic and the cortex, and talked about a lot of happiness and self-confidence really comes from the self-talk in your head, how you view the world. And I see that in younger people. I'm wondering, in your journey of re-energizing and reading, did filling your head with these more aspirational, positive, productive things, do you think they made you happier?
Oh, I think so, by and large. Yeah, I think that's safe to say. I was happier in part because I felt better about myself. I felt like I had a better understanding of how the world worked. I felt like I was doing things many of my colleagues weren't doing. I felt like I was a better employee. I felt like I was a more valuable employee. At that time, I was working for someone else.
Okay.
Like I was a better husband, So yeah, I think all around I was happier.
Okay. Now, do you have any opinion on new books versus old books? There are some people that say, I don't read anything that's not 10 years because it hasn't matured and the idea hasn't, been validated yet. Do you have any opinion on new books versus old books?
Well, I think there's value to be found regardless of the age of the book. I mean, I love to go back and read Zig Ziglar and Og Mandino, books that have been around for 20, 30 plus years. But there are new books, in my opinion, coming out all the time that are just as fascinating, that are looking at, for example, the changing world of work. Mm-hmm. and how we as a society, those of us in the U.S. At least, need to be ready for. Things are changing, and many of us aren't ready for that change. What used to require a factory and 200 workers often today can be done with a laptop and an internet connection. And so many of us just haven't accepted that reality, and there are a number of books. This is just one example, but there are a number of books that are tackling subjects like that and helping you be the kind of individual, employee or otherwise, who is best prepared for that new future.
That is a really good point. It's, if we just read older wisdom and knowledge, we get, we have this sort of paint by numbers approach, and there's all these ways that we can thrive outside those lines, and
mm-hmm.
we can't get stuck in the past, especially. You're about my age, I guess. I'm 49. And
mm-hmm.
if you're looking at becoming more independent, you can thrive if you realize you don't have to play by the old rules that we learned 20 years ago. Yeah,
that was so key for me. In fact, I used to be the kind of person, Roger, who could not imagine not knowing 100% exactly how much money I was going to make month to month. So I was psychologically dependent upon a steady paycheck. And that felt like security and safety to me. But it was the reading that I began doing, particularly around 2009, 2010, that opened my eyes to a new way of thinking. And I got comfortable because of the reading I was doing with the idea of not necessarily needing to work for somebody else, and realizing that that's not as secure as I think it is, and that there's a lot to be said for freedom.
Now how old are you, Jeff?
I'm 50.
You're 50. Okay. So you're a perfect example of that, in that you were in the radio industry, which is not always a secure industry, right? It's the artistic whims of we cut the show and everything else. And now you are a full-time entrepreneur and living that. You're not retired, but you're not employed.
Right.
You're somewhere in between, and I imagine you manage your own schedule. We're recording this on a Saturday morning, so it's not a 9-to-5 job.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess did that help you get to where you are today, journey-wise?
The reading, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I would not be able to do, I think, any of the things I'm doing right now, radio career notwithstanding. I would not be nearly as prepared for self-employment and the kind of schedule I had today were it not for the books that I took the time to read and that helped me wrap my head around what it was going to take to succeed in this new chapter.
Now, I read a article, well, I think actually it was in a book, which is sort of ironic, that sort of freed me a little bit, in that it made the argument that you don't have to finish a book. We my wife and I'm like, man, I start a book and I get worried about, especially nonfiction or fiction. If I start it, if it sucks, I'm going to have to finish it. And it sort of gave me permission, not that I needed it, that you don't have to finish a book. Do you agree with that?
I completely agree with that. I think the first person I saw broach that subject was Michael Hyatt on his blog, and I'm a firm believer in that as well. Most of the books that I read in preparation for interviews, when it's time to do the interview, 9 times out of 10, I've not read the book from cover to cover. I used to think that I had to, that I needed to, and that I needed to ask a question of the guest out of every chapter. But my job in the case of Read to Lead is to distill the key insights and main ideas. And I think as a reader of nonfiction, that's what I try to do, not only in the case of people I'm interviewing for the show, but just in my, general enjoyment anyway. And so I'll often start with the introduction and then read the end to kind of get an idea of, okay, here's what the author hopes to impart to me, and now I go to the end, and here's what I'm to go off and do now that I've read this, and then I'll look at chapter titles, and sometimes pick a la carte the ones that I want to start with. Oftentimes in a nonfiction book, you can do that. Not all nonfiction books, but oftentimes you can do that, and I'll start there and not necessarily read chapters in order, and read the parts and the pieces that I think apply to me or that I need for where I'm at in that particular stage, and then set it aside. And I don't any longer think of it as, oh, I can't say I've read that book because I haven't finished it. No, if I've read the parts of it that I wanted to read, then I've read that book as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I think some of it has to do with what you want to extract from the book, especially with nonfiction.
Yeah.
There are some books like Lynchpin that you may read more deeply because it shifts your paradigm. It's actually, giving you mind-bending concepts that change how you think. And then there are other books like Good to Great as a good example where it's more prescriptive. March Above the Death Line or Bullets and Cannonballs, that you can sort of grab that one and apply it. So
Big, hairy, audacious goals.
There you go. Now, do you have any tips? Well, I guess we covered some, but any tips on extracting wisdom from books that you've learned?
Yeah, and there's research to back this up. You mentioned research earlier. I think for me at least, and I think for most people, if you're going to act upon what you're reading or you want to increase the likelihood that you're going to do that, I think you have to be prepared to take notes, to put pen to paper. And I prefer pen to paper versus, keyboard to screen personally. There's just something about writing it down. So whether that's writing in the margins of the book or highlighting or underlining, I actually like to take it a step beyond that, and I dedicate a notebook to the reading that I'm doing and start a new section. And as I read things I want to remember and or implement, I take notes in that notebook and refer back to it often. And I think for me, and I think for a lot of people, though, that's the best way. That's the clearest and most likely way you're going to actually do something with what you're consuming. Because what happens with a lot of us is, we read and we go on to the next thing and we read some more and we don't actually do anything with what we're reading. It's sort of, we get stuck in this intention mode that never leads to implementation. Reading is not enough. I mean, it's great that you're doing that. You're doing something that most people don't do on a regular basis. But if that's all you do and you just fill your head with that knowledge, then what have you really gained? Maybe you're a good conversationalist, but I think you need to get to that implementation stage and actually begin acting upon what it is you're reading, in large part because it's no longer enough just to be the person that knows stuff. You have to be the kind of person who is not just an idea person, but a person who can implement on those ideas.
Yeah, I always say I can Google knowledge. I can't Google wisdom. Right? You can't.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
This was probably the most important part so far in our conversation, other than just listening to your voice because it's so smoothing. So jealous. Because I struggle with that because I listen to a lot of audiobooks. And then if I like the audiobook, I'll usually get the Kindle book. But then I can't do, trying to take notes or highlight in a Kindle book is awkward and, it's hard to extract it. So then I'll buy the physical book. So, there may be less people reading, but I'm guessing the people that are buying more of the same book because I buy the physical book because I want to write in it. But I like this idea of keeping basically a book journal and imagine what you'll have from that, 10 years from now, if it's all in one binder or multiple, it'll be your own encyclopedia that you created.
Exactly. Yeah. And when I was working and commuting every day, the only way for me to consume books was in audio form. I needed to leverage that commute time somehow, some way, and that was the only time I was able to find to dedicate to reading. And so if that's the only option you have, then by all means, leverage it as best you can. I'm like you. If I have a choice, then I would prefer to have the physical book. There's research around too how we remember things that we read and how we consume books. And if you're reading something in a particular chapter and you're reminded of something you read before or earlier in that book, you think of where that thing is in terms of where it was on the page and what side of the book it was on. And you have sort of in a physical book at any given moment, where you are relative to where you've been and where you're going.
And you can flip back easily and reference.
Yeah. And then, of course, an audiobook and even in an ebook, you don't have that same frame of reference. And that's one of the many reasons why I prefer the physical book to the other options.
Especially for old lions like us, because that's ingrained in us because of how, maybe our kids who read less physical things, they didn't have that experience that is just hardwired into them.
Right.
One quick question on that journaling. Do you do that while you're reading the book, or do you notate in the book and then go back and create your abstract?
I generally do it while I'm reading.
Okay.
I find that works best. Now, it takes a little longer to get through a book when you're doing it that way. I'm not a speed reader by utilizing that method, but I'm okay with that. I prefer to write things down while they're fresh. As what I'm reading sparks ideas, it's important for me to get it on paper as soon as possible because I'm 50. I'll forget if I don't.
Well, I like that because if you just read, it's like candy. It gives you the fix, but really what you need is compound carbohydrates that can last a while. So you need to get it down and in there. I like that.
Right.
So, I imagine because of your podcast, you pick books, but it must be a little harder to be intentional about the books you pick because you're reviewing a book almost every week, right?
Yeah, and I do have a lot laid down in front of me, and so I'm very particular about what I choose. To me, it's very important to vet the books that I feature on the show and the authors that I'm going to interview. I think it's important that I respect my listeners' time, and they need to know when I present an author and a book to them, it's one that I think is worthy of their time and attention. Otherwise, what's the point, right?
Yeah,
it's not a book review podcast. If the book is featured on the show, then you can rest assured I've already deemed it to be worthy of your time and attention. And so I try to be, as best I can, very intentional about the books that I do choose for the show because I'm going to spend my time reading them. Now, that does mean that sometimes I will start a book, and oftentimes I'll do this before ever extending an invitation to an author unless I have a relationship with them or familiar with their history already. I'll begin reading a book and decide not to extend an invitation because I was not captured by what I read or felt like anything necessarily new or dramatically different was being offered. That means I do some reading that never sees the light of day as far as the show is concerned.
Now, I have to ask this as my final question. You went from corporate America working, and we've talked about how books have helped transform how you think about things to now you're independent. I need to come up with a name. You're not retired, but you're not working. You're working on your own terms.
Mm-hmm.
What are 3 books, or however many number you want to name, that really helped you in that journey to change how you thought about that?
Yeah, one of the early ones was 48 Days to the Work You Love by Dan Miller, a book that came out originally, I think, 11 or 12 years ago, almost 12 years ago. 10th anniversary edition came out a little less than 2 years ago, I guess. And so that was one early on. Linchpins, you mentioned Linchpins. That was another Seth Godin book. In general, I would say books that continue to just help me on a daily basis, really, in what I do, and books that I refer back to often are books by Todd Henry, a book called Die Empty, Unleash Your Best Work Every Day. I'm a big fan of that book. His more recent book is called Louder Than Words, which is also a great one. And Jeff Goins' work has been instrumental.
Jeff's a very good guy. Well, they all are. Everybody you mentioned are very nice people.
Yeah, his latest book, he's working on a new one now, but his last one came out last year, is called The Art of Work. And that one, I think, is one that I refer back to again and again. And it's just great for those of us working for ourselves and looking to, make as Steve Jobs once said, I think, or make our dent in the universe.
Jeff Brown from Read to Lead podcast, which is a great podcast, and we're going to be releasing, and I'll add the books that Jeff mentioned here to our resource for reading material. Jeff, thank you for spending the time with me.
It was too short.
Hey, welcome to the Happy Lab. I just came back from Denver and gave a presentation, a 20-minute talk, which was great. I love doing that. It's very exciting. But there was another speaker who was a doctor, and I'm going to get him on the show because he is a very dynamic guy and has some great information. And he was talking about how we process information, the limbic and the cortex. And the limbic, I guess, is like the emotional fight or flight. That's the emotional center, and that's where information comes in first. The neocortex is where we think, right? One of the things that he said that was really interesting was that our state of mind and our happiness levels and our confidence levels really come down to our self-talk. Beyond any books that we read, it's the conversations that we have in our head that have the most influence on how content and how happy we are in life. And I think that is so true because I remember in my 20s and my 30s, I was really a grumpy guy and had really, really negative self-talk. And then as I've matured and as I put more healthy information in my head through podcasts and through books, gradually that self-talk changed. Now, most people that meet me think I'm a happy, confident guy, and I think I am, where I still sometimes think of myself as way back, but I think this is really important, so I can't wait to get him on the show. I'm not sure when it's going to happen yet, but when you're reading books, think about the kind of language that it's going to put into your head so you can develop positive self-talk, because that's going to make you a happier person.
On your marks, get set.
All right, well, this is an easy one. Welcome to the Smart Sprint segment. In the next 7 days, either sign up for SixShots Saturday so you can get that Retirement Answer Man listener reading list, or when you get it, take a look at it and highlight 12 books for next year that you want to make sure that you read so we can start building a reading list and be more intentional about the stuff that we're going to put in our head. That's going to make you thrive going forward. I almost guarantee it. I can't say guarantee. You got to take that back. I'm an investment advisor. You never say guarantee. I'm pretty sure it will. Anyway, I suggest you do it. It'd be great. Hey, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the Retirement Answer Man show. I'm so excited to get this book compilation, this Retirement Answer Man reading list out to you. If you are getting overwhelmed and aren't sure where you're at after this election, and you want to have a snapshot of where you're at on your road to retirement, or you want to work with somebody to help you develop the plan or actually walk life with you, I am available and accepting clients. You can go to rogerwhitney.com, click on Work with Roger. I think it says Work with Roger or Work with Me. And all we'll do is you fill out a quick form and we can just have a 20-minute conversation to see if it's a fit. Regardless, I always love having you on the show. It's one of my favorite parts of the week. Until next week, this is Roger Whitney, the Retirement Answer Man.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.